so we are entering into August at this point, which is extremely hard to believe. And here in Ohio, we're starting to think about fall food plots, and hopefully you've already been thinking about them for at least a few weeks now, just because I think it's super important to get in there and get things killed ahead of time. But I wanted to jump on here and put together, I'm going to say quick video, but it's probably not going to be a quick video, just kind of giving my 2 cents on fall food plots. I know when I first got into them, food plots in general, it was just a lot of information, a lot of conflicting information, and pretty overwhelming, quite frankly. So I thought I would give kind of what I've learned and what I've found works best for me. This is by no means high-level food plot information. I don't consider myself to be super knowledgeable on the topic. However, I think I have a pretty good baseline knowledge that maybe for someone who's just getting into it, this would be really good information. If you have come from an agriculture background, this is not up to your speed. We are not even speaking the same language, so probably not the right video for you. But there's a few different topics I want to go through, and then we'll break each one down individually. So the very first one is planting dates. So a few different things that I have noted here to talk about. I would say the first thing is understand your geographical location. So where that's going to come into play is understanding what your annual average first frost date is. That's something that you can easily go into Google, type in for your area, and figure out. It's going to probably be a range. Obviously, the first frost is not the same day every year. However, it typically falls within a couple weeks of each other. So figure out what that is, and then you can go to generally the label on the variety of seed that you're planning on planting, and it should give you a maturation rate or a maturity rate, which would be a number of days that it takes for that plant to mature. And I'm not necessarily saying that you have to plant to give that plant adequate time to reach maturity. There's obviously an argument to be made that less mature plants are more attractive or more palatable to deer and other varieties of game. But that's a good place to start. So understand how long that plant's going to take to mature, and that's going to kind of give you a baseline range. So in my case, the average annual first frost date in my area ranges between October 21st and October 31st. And then from there was a 75 to 90 day maturity rate for the variety of seed that I was planting, which was a brassica. And then I basically calculated an early plant date and a late plant date. So from the early frost date of October 21st back 90 days, which was the longest maturity rate, calculated all the way back to July 23rd was the earliest I could possibly plant, which I've never planted that early. And then taking the later frost date and subtracting 75 days would give me my late plant date, which was August 17th. And generally that August date is kind of typically where I fall. I find myself often planting around the 21st of August. And actually this year I was going to be planting sooner. Today is July 30th. And I was trying to plant just a couple days ago because I saw 3 days of rain coming, and unfortunately a mechanical breakdown prevented that, which is okay. But that leads me to my probably last point on the planting date topic, and that is choose your date based on the weather. Don't get so caught up on being early or being late as you should probably concern yourself with rain. Find out when those rain events are coming. Ideally, you're picking one that has a really high chance, and hopefully a significant amount of rainfall. Obviously, maybe not a monsoon to where you're washing away your seed, but get out ahead of some rain and get that seed in the ground. I think that pretty much wraps up plant dates. We'll transition into the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that was soil amendments. So again, I don't have a ton of ag knowledge, and soil amendments and soil composition and soil nutrients gets super in the weeds. I try to keep my knowledge enough to be dangerous, but I don't need much more than what I need to know for food plots. I'm not a farmer as much as I like to pretend I am some weekends. I'm simply not. So jumping into soil amendments, the first thing you're going to want to do is get a soil test. Where I'm planting, I generally have decent soil, not too many rocks, plenty of topsoil and organic matter in that soil. There are places like strip mine land, and I'm sure plenty of regions around the U.S. where there is no topsoil, there's no organic matter, and quite frankly, you're going to struggle to get anything established. Start with a soil test. Do not neglect this part, because this is basically setting yourself up for the future success of that plot, or failure in the case that you don't do one. So I've got an example here, and this was a soil test that I got this year on a larger plot that I'm planting. So as you can see, my actual soil pH is 5.6. I'm not going to get into buffer pH. That is probably more than you need to know, and quite frankly, it's not something I know a whole lot about, so I'm trying not to speak outside of my lane. And then the soil test will give you a desired pH or a recommended pH, and that's your target to get to. So to correct for pH, that's where you're going to be using and applying lime. And there's different types of lime that you can use, and we'll get into that. But that is what you're looking at there. Generally, soils are going to be more acidic, and lime corrects and tries to neutralize that acidity. So got my soil sample up here, and then down below you can see what we're looking at for different nutrients. And I'll jump forward here to these are the recommended amendments to be made to my food plot. So here is an example of how to calculate that. It's pretty self-explanatory. Depending on what soil test you do, there's better ones and there's worse ones. This one is a Whitetail Institute. They're very easy to use. You go out into the field, collect your samples, try to get enough samples across the entire food plot that you're getting a very good average. If you've planted it in the past and applied lime in the past, you don't want to heavily favor any particular area in case that area is too much or too little lime or fertilizer or whatever it is, to where you're not getting an accurate picture of the overall food plot. Also, be sure not to be using anything that is going to contaminate your sample. So some people use metal probes or shovels. Certainly a shovel could cause you problems. Most soil probes are made out of something that's not going to contaminate your sample. In the past, I've used just a real small, almost like a little spade, a plastic spade, or a trowel. And that worked fine. This year I did upgrade to a soil probe just because I found myself needing to collect so many samples that it wasn't real efficient to do it with a little shovel. So here we've got our recommendations. I have also went through the county ag extension office, and pretty much every county should have one of those. And they did a good job giving me the recommendations that I needed for application rates and stuff. They're someone that's kind of at your disposal. You can give them a call, and about the same price point. These ones I order off Amazon. They come in the mail, and you can have the results emailed back to you. Very easy, very user-friendly, and not so much information for people that are only wanting them for, basic food plots. So I did a quick example calculation. So they give different recommendations by pounds per acre or pounds per 1,000 square feet. So if you're less than an acre, you're going to look at that pounds per 1,000 square feet calculation. If you're over an acre, you're going to look at that pounds per acre. So just for an example, I used a half-acre food plot, and to convert to square feet, you're going to multiply by 43,560 square feet to an acre, which would give you 21,780 square feet. So to calculate pounds per 1,000 square feet, you're going to then need to divide that by 1,000, which gives you a factor of 21.78. And for the example of the lime down here, You're going to multiply that by 58 pounds per 1,000 square feet, which gives you 1,263 pounds of lime needed to reach that desired target pH. And then dropping down to the fertilizer, as you can see, depending on which variety you're planting, let's just say we're planting turnips, you're also going to need to consider what fertilizers are available in your area. So that's something I'm always constantly paying attention to. I'm always analyzing not only prices at different locations, but also what fertilizers are available. So 10-10-10 is giving you the percentages of nutrients that are in that fertilizer, and that's nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. So obviously a 20-20-20 is stronger and will need less quantity than a 10-10-10 would. So generally I have no trouble finding a 20-20 or a 20-19 in my area. So for this calculation, again, we calculate the square feet, divide that to get our 21.78 factor, and then for 20-20, we need 13.77 pounds per 1,000 square feet, which calculates out to 300 pounds of 20-20 to correct for this food plot, and that'll give us the nutrients we need. So getting into pelletized versus ag lime, there's arguments to be made for either. There's also a lot of conflicting information that you can find on the internet, and truthfully, I don't have all the answers for it. There's scholarly documents on the internet to advocate for either opinion that's out there. Generally, it's pretty accepted that pelletized lime will not last as long in that soil and keep that pH up as long as ag lime would. So ag lime tends to last longer and keep that pH up longer, which would obviously make an argument for being worth the additional cost to do the ag lime over pelletized. Pelletized generally lasts only a year or two, and then you're going to start to see that decrease again. So this probably isn't the case everywhere, but I can actually get pelletized lime a little bit cheaper in one spot that I know of, and you can make the argument that it would be saving money to just do the pelletized lime every single year, even if you have to do it every single year, versus ag lime, which you would have to do every few years. However, you also have to consider the cost of mobilizing to the area that you're doing it, the fuel, the tractor, your own time, and I'm not sure that it's actually worth it. So that's going to be something that I'm analyzing. The other thing that seems to conflict information based on where you're reading it would be whether it's actually faster acting or not. So a lot of argument is made that the pelletized lime works quicker. However, you can also find information that suggests that it does not. They talk about the granule size, and an ag lime is more like a powder. And there's a lot of information out there that argues one way or another, but there's a lot of information that actually says that there is no benefit to using one or the other if you're looking for a faster means of getting your pH raised. There also is some information about a reduced rate. If you're going to use pelletized lime, you only have to apply X percentage of the recommendation based on what they're recommending for ag lime. I haven't been able to find much on that. Talking with the guy at our local extension office, he actually said there is no such thing as a max rate to apply. Whatever that soil test says is what you need to put down. You're not going to max it out, and you're also not going to see that full benefit of the desired pH right away. I mean, it's going to take some years to get that up, or some time, maybe not years, to get that up. And follow your soil test. I think that's the most important thing. Is a lot of people either entirely neglect to do a soil test, or people will get the soil test done, make that effort on the front end, And then once they see how much it's going to cost them to do all those recommended amendments to their soil, they just kind of scrap it, or just say, you know, I can get by with, say, 50% of whatever's recommended. The fertilizer benefits the lime, and the lime benefits the fertilizer. It's kind of a, you know, hand-in-hand thing. The lime, raising that pH, has numerous benefits, but the main one is that it allows more of those nutrients to be available to the plants for uptake. So obviously, if there's more nutrients available, those plants are A, going to grow better, but B, be able to be more nutrient dense for the animals that are eating them. And I'm not a huge proponent of the idea of the fact that minerals or nutrients of any kind are going to drastically change, you know, a buck that should be 140 to take him to a 170. However, I do believe that the more nutrients that are available to a deer, there might be some change. Obviously, every deer has a glass ceiling of potential, genetic potential, and the goal is to get that deer as healthy as possible so that he can be as close to that as possible. So there's no real way to measure it. You know, 1 year with really bad nutrient food plots versus really nutritious food plots, and gauge it. It'd be cool if you could do that, like clone the same deer and, you know, isolate them and conduct that study. However, that's obviously not possible. However, where I do see more of a benefit in potentially producing larger antler deer is through fetal programming. Obviously, you know, in countries where there's very, very poor nutrition, children that are born under really deficient conditions generally do not develop the same way, even into adulthood, as the way that a child with really good nutrition at birth would develop. So what I'm getting at is that the does that are feeding on those nutrient-dense food plots are going to have really healthy bodies to raise really healthy fawns. They birth those fawns, and from, you know, in the doe to birth and then into, you know, adulthood as a deer, could express even better genetic potential. So that would be why applying the lime is so important to allowing those plants to obviously take up the nutrients, make those nutrients available to the plants. You can pretty much lime at any time. There's really no rhyme or reason with that. You can kind of go in as long as you can get it on the ground. That soil is going to take it up. Fertilizing, I like to do that at the time of planting and not fertilize basically way ahead of time to where I'm fertilizing the weeds. I want those varieties that I'm putting into the ground to get that benefit. So the last thing I wanted to touch on are the variables, and these are the things that I like to say are up to God. You want to do everything to that point of getting the seed in the ground and walking away as perfect and as to a T as possible, because when or if something goes wrong and you have that failure, which will happen no matter how well you try to do things, you want to know that you did it right. Because if you skipped a step at anywhere in this process, when you get that failure, you're going to blame it on that or wonder if it was that. So if you don't skip anything, you do everything right, then you can look back and know you did everything right, and then try to determine what it was that caused that failure. So a few things that obviously I've taken notice to over the years, I would say number one is lack of rain. I've dealt with this during the fall food plot season, actually this year, the spring food plot season even, pretty much every year. So fall food plots tend to be a dry time of year, and that was the reason I was trying to plant this past weekend, is because I saw three straight days of rain coming, and I was trying to get ahead of that. It seems like later into August, for whatever reason, it's just a really dry time of year, and even September sometimes. So I'm trying to get ahead of some rain, and I'm going to be looking to plant here in the next couple weeks, in Ohio at least. If you're further south than here, it's probably still pretty early for you yet. The guys way north of us have already hopefully gotten their seed in the ground. If not, probably right about now, they're still trying to get it in. So I would say timing is the number one thing, the number one variable that can have an effect on the success or failure of your food plot. Obviously, flooding, if you're in an area that tends to flood, I've got one of those. Again, uncontrollable, and that would also be indicative of a lot of rain, which can be good up to a point, but too much rain is a bad thing in some places. And then wind, hail, stuff like that. I mean, obviously it damages commercial farmers' crops, and it can have the same effect on your food plots. One I have not had to deal with, fortunately, is disease. I've heard a lot of people say, you shouldn't try to plant brassicas in the same field for more than 2 years in a row. You should rotate something else in, because there are some diseases that tend to start to develop at that point. I feel like I've done a pretty good job of rotating brassicas out. However, they're extremely palatable and highly attractive in a couple of the areas that I hunt, so I try to get those in the ground as much as I possibly can. One I have had a lot of issues with is deer browse. So it's a good and bad problem to have. I mean, it probably means you have a lot of deer. However, it can be a really, really frustrating thing to fight. High deer density areas, especially areas with minimal ag, to kind of take on some of those deer in the bean fields and stuff. I really fight this. If you have an option of putting up an electric fence of some kind, that's an option. There's the Milorganite, or whatever it's called, the human waste that you can put on food plots. It's like a pelletized or granular thing that you can spread. I've heard a lot of good things about that. And one of the things that I've started doing over the past few years that I really can attest to is putting up utilization cages. So this is another one of those benchmarks that you can use to gauge why your food plot failed. And this one kind of will help rule out or prove that it was due to browse pressure. Is put a stake in the ground and just get some sort of chicken wire or fencing and make a real small 4 foot tall circle, and you'll be able to see what comes up in there. And obviously, if you come back to your food plot and you have lush, beautiful XYZ, whatever you plant in that utilization cage, and the whole rest of the field is down to the dirt, it's probably the deer and not something that you did wrong. That was an issue that I had last year, and I think the root cause of that was the fact that it was a really dry year, the plants were really stunted, and then on top of that, those plants were holding a lot of moisture that the deer weren't getting elsewhere, so they really targeted those big leaves to get the moisture that they were lacking. And then my utilization cage was nice, big, beautiful leafy brassicas with big bulbs underneath of them, but that's something I would recommend. It's extremely cheap, and it helps you learn. So that would be something I'd recommend. And then one of the last things I would recommend doing is looking at the seed label. Educate yourself. There's a lot of good stuff out there, and there's a lot of bad stuff out there. A lot of these big box store brand seeds are just junk seed thrown in a bag with a cool label on it and a big deer on the front. Understand test dates. Here's an example of a label that is at a local store that I shop at often. I have planted this blend, and as you can see, the test date shows January of 2021. Now, I've done my due diligence and I figured out that that is not the actual test date. That is the original label that they put on this seed bin, that has never been updated since. However, there is a different label that they do not have, out where you can very easily see it, that shows the updated test date. However, if you had yourself educated, you would see that 2021 test date and pump the brakes. That seed needs to be fresh, it needs to be new, and as you get further and further away from that test date, especially years away from that test date, you're losing germination rates dramatically. And that transitions into the next thing, which is germination rates themselves. Those are on the seed label. You need to be looking into those. They take a small sample of the seed in that batch and will test what percent of those seeds are germinating. So obviously a higher germination rate is best. And then understand weed, seed, and inert matter. They put fillers in these things to add weight, and those are not things that are stuff you want growing in your food plot. Obviously, weed seed is not something that you want, so a high weed seed content is not a good thing. So you want a good clean seed. Another thing would be to get a good kill before you plant. This is something I've put a lot more effort into getting here in the last couple years, and actually when the tiller broke down this weekend, I was not super upset because I sprayed this food plot 2 weeks ago. I like to get a good kill, and there was still a lot of green weeds in there. You want those plants, those weeds, to be dead all the way down to the root. You want that root to be dead, because if that root's not dead and you go in there and chop it up with a tiller or hit it with a disc, and you're not actually chopping up those roots and killing those roots, so as soon as you plant, those weeds already have a jump start on you. Generally, you're not getting all the vegetation when you go in and till or disc anyhow. So anything you leave behind already has a jump start on a little tiny seed that you're trying to grow from nothing, versus something with an established root system. Lastly, a reason or a variable that might lead to the success or failure of your food plot would be weed competition. So obviously that's a direct result of your good kill or lack of good kill, but you should consider that when you do have a failure, is whether it was caused by weed competition. There's residual herbicides which are applied and stay active in the ground. Obviously most of what we're using is a post-emergent or foliar herbicide, which is applied directly to that plant. If you have clover, you're probably spraying like clethodim, which is a grass killer, 2,4-DB, something like that, Buterac. Those are going directly on the plant to kill weeds and will not kill your desired crop. There's all kinds of different things. There's a lot to understand there and a lot to unpack there, but something to be mentioned is it's not a bad thing to consider whether or not weed competition was the reason for your failure. So I think that pretty much wraps up kind of the few things that I wanted to talk about. I know that's a lot to take in, but there's a lot to talk about there, and I just tried to touch briefly on each little thing. You could certainly get into depth even more on every little subtopic. However, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. We are by no means experts, but I feel like, having a few years of this under our belt, we've established a pretty good baseline knowledge of food plots, and some of the variables and things that come along with them. So appreciate you tuning in, and like I said, drop a comment if you have questions.